It's our cities. It's where we live. It's where we raise children. It's where we try and build our lives. Are they spaces of pride, or is their physical state causing grave concern? And just what can we do about it? National disasters, explosions just a few weeks ago, infrastructure challenges. The questions are mounting, and so they should, with good reason, especially with the elections next year. Is it still good enough for you? And now you have to ask the question, what are those spaces going to be like in 10 or even 20 years? What we are facing now seems like a never-ending uphill battle. Well, senior reporter Aviwe Mtila focused on Johannesburg and Durban, and he filed this report.
Johannesburg, the city of gold located in the wealthiest province on the African continent, but a city in decay. The recent, yet-to-be-explained explosion in the inner city is just one indication of Johannesburg not being in good shape. The city was established as a result of the discovery of gold and would go on to produce the richest gold fields on earth.
In 1886, when gold was discovered, there was very little here. There were some old Boer farms, and the Sotho people who were indigenous to this area lived, but in very sort of sparsely populated, on the sort of grasslands that you see. Then gold was discovered, and you had this enormous gold rush. Literally tens of thousands of people from all over the world basically converged on Johannesburg and the surrounding towns of the Witwatersrand to basically make their fortunes.
As a gold boom town, the infrastructure wasn't prepared. The people arrived before the infrastructure. So you already had a mass influx of people searching for their fortune in the gold under the ground before anyone thought that Johannesburg would become a permanent settlement. But yes, the government quickly had to respond. At the time, it was the old Zuid-Afrikaanse Republic, and they designated Johannesburg as a settlement in September 1886. No one thought that Johannesburg would last for very long.
Beating the odds, Johannesburg would rapidly develop from a shanty mining town into a formidable city.
It was larger than Cape Town, which had been established in 1652. It was only 3 decades old. It was proclaimed a city towards the end of the 1920s, and it was growing so fast that it couldn't be properly planned. It was growing faster than you could put in the infrastructure. And here's Hillbrow in the north, and there's Marshalltown and inner city.
The first high-rise development in the inner city went up in the 1930s. This would lead to the dense, high-rise central precinct with infrastructure being installed as the money rolled in.
Johannesburg experienced rapid growth in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and more infrastructure was put in, layers and layers of infrastructure. But then in the 1970s, the growth stopped in the inner city. The Carlton Centre and the Carlton Hotel was the last major development in inner city Johannesburg for many decades. In fact, the hotel, which was going to be Johannesburg's 5-star hotel, was never opened. Because business at that time started to move into the suburbs. They started to move to Sandton, to Rosebank, and later to places like Four Ways and Greenstone. The business started to decentralize.
And as business moved out, the inner city took on another form.
From the 1990s, the city began to change and became a residential as well as a business center. Buildings that were previously office buildings were now filled up with people, migrants, moving into the inner city. Joburg inner city became a very, very important destination for cross-border trade. And so colleague Tanya Zak tells us that the money made through cross-border trade, buses coming from as far afield as Zambia and Malawi, is more than the income generated by Sandton City, for example.
The population of Johannesburg was about 3.8 million at that time, and that is 1996. And the population of Gauteng was just about 8 million. Okay, we are now sitting less than 30 years later with a population of Gauteng of 16 million people, and a population for Johannesburg well over 6 million people within its municipal area. So there's been a tremendous influx of people.
With a 77 billion rand budget, you'd expect infrastructure to be the least of the city's worries. But the lack of refurbishment of its major infrastructure is now exposing the decaying city.
Most forms of infrastructure need to be replaced at least every 30 years. But what began to happen in the inner city is, with this neglect, is that you didn't have maintenance and replacement of that infrastructure. And that was over an extended period from the 1970s. And now with the increased population density, there's more demand for that infrastructure, more need for that infrastructure, but the infrastructure is aging. And so in the inner city today, we've got infrastructure, some of it maybe 80, 90 years old, even older. Some of it, even 1970, is, what is that, 50 years ago? That's old.
And the challenge of infrastructure neglect has spread from the inner city right across the Gauteng province.
A place like Emfuleni is definitely in meltdown. And it's not like a small place. It's got, it's got Vereniging van der Bijl Park, it's got Sebokeng, and a number of other big townships. So we're talking about a significant, proportion of the population. So I think, but it's a set of interrelated factors, and maybe I should just say a couple of things about that. I think the one is, in an overarching sense, is governance, and I think that the fact that we don't have stability, particularly at the level of coalitions, is a big problem. So I think that's the one big issue. I think that the quality of the officials of the administration has also declined over time. So that kind of technical capacity that we're looking for is not just replacing people with broad, like say, HR skills, organizational development skills, when actually you need an engineer.
KwaZulu-Natal also has its fair share of infrastructure challenges exacerbated by global warming.
One just has to look a year ago, just over a year ago, with the floods. The areas that were hit hardest were areas that were unplanned settlements, informal settlements, people that located themselves in areas that were unsafe, where they should not have been. Is that government's fault? So that's a difficult question to answer, because had the enforcement authorities prevented them from locating there, that would have mitigated the disaster. So that's just one part of the argument. The second part of the argument is the issue of ailing infrastructure in South Africa. It's a South African problem, not just an eThekwini problem. And one has to ask the question, why?
Professor Philip Harrison believes he has the answer.
The problem we have is that, let me say, it's not very sexy to maintain infrastructure. You don't cut ribbons if you're maintaining infrastructure. That's a challenge. So politicians would rather see developments as visible developments, that they can show their electorate that they're doing something. If you're putting money into maintenance, that's invisible. You're not getting political credit. So there's a constant pressure, I think, for more rapid, visible results, perhaps for the next election. And there's less pressure to do the more difficult thing and the longer-term job of maintaining the infrastructure that you already have.
The other challenge hampering the refurbishment of infrastructure is corruption.
When we look at a metro like eThekwini, and this is an interesting fact, that at the dawn of our democratic dispensation, eThekwini was one of the wealthiest municipalities in the country with a surplus of money. Today, they are in financial difficulties, and we've heard in the past that they didn't have enough money to pay staff. In the last few years, there's been qualified Auditor General reports saying that there's been unjustified expenditure. So you have to ask yourself, in the case of eThekwini, Is it a case of there not being enough money, or is the money being misappropriated and not being used for the purpose?
In Johannesburg, the neglected underground tunnels are proving to be a nightmare.
The tunnels that were built, particularly in the early years of the last century, to move things around, there were several examples of that. And one was the tunnels around the post office, which would allow the mail from the old Russick Street post office, and then later, and I think even the big headquarters in the Jeppe Street post office, to convey the stuff directly to Park Station to enable an efficient movement of mail. And there are also tunnels, just as a matter of interest, around Constitution Hill, which used to be the Fort Prison, right, where you know, prisoners would also be moved and so on.
We have hidden tunnels underneath the city, the old postal tunnels, in which messengers would move between one building and the next building and to the old post office. What is happening in those tunnels? But more importantly, what is happening to our many, many layers of infrastructure under the city? And what is the quality of that infrastructure? To what extent is that infrastructure decaying? And that's really, really important knowledge that we need. So I think we need a serious investigation into subterranean Johannesburg. And because the subterranean has an impact on what happens on the city above.
Professor Harrison doesn't doubt the recent blast in the inner city was caused by activity in these very tunnels.
Well, it clearly did. I don't know at what depth and exactly what the cause of the explosion is, but it's something that happened underneath the street that caused all the chaos on the street and above. So maybe if we had more knowledge, that could have been forestalled or prevented. Because remember, those infrastructures are under huge pressure. So even garbage, which is pouring into the pipes beneath the city, blocking up important conduits and preventing air from coming in and out, and a buildup of methane gas, that may have had something to do with it. So these are the pressures from above that are affecting the infrastructure below, and the infrastructure below is going to talk back.
With the odds stacked against getting to the bottom of our infrastructure woes in a system that's overburdened and impacted by neglect and corruption, one expert still believes it's possible to get it right.
We've got world-class universities with really fantastic skills. We've got a private sector, and many of which are world-class companies, and they're able to go throughout the world and prosper. We have a core in government which is still very, and many centers of excellence. There are many decaying parts, but they also say centers of excellence, and we just need to really put our kind of shoulder to the wheel, get the right leadership, focus on the right things, and I think we're able to move forward. And I don't think it's just sort of optimism for its own sake. I think that we do have the potential. Let us remember what happened in 2010. We all said, oh, the most wonderful thing is happening to our country. We're having the Football World Cup. We're putting our shoulders to the wheel, and we delivered on the stadium. And you remember what Sepp Blatter said. He said at that time it was the best organized World Cup ever. If we can do that.
Aviwe Mtila, Johannesburg.
Oh, fantastic look into what's actually happening under the ground in Johannesburg. Now,